The evening sun cast long shadows across the small-town diner's weathered sign, a familiar landmark that had stood proudly on Cherry Street for over 4 decades. Inside, the warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee and homemade pie filled the air, while the gentle clink of silverware created a comforting symphony that locals had come to associate with the Blue Plate Diner. At table 7, an elderly woman in her mid-70s sat quietly, her silver hair neatly pinned back, and her kind eyes taking in the familiar surroundings. She wore a simple floral dress and carried a well-loved leather purse that had seen better days. To any observer, she appeared to be just another regular customer enjoying an early dinner, but there was much more to her story than met the eye. The diner buzzed with its usual dinner rush energy. A young waitress, who had started working there just 3 months ago, moved between tables with an air of irritation. Her name tag was slightly crooked, and her uniform showed signs of a long day's work. She had been having a particularly rough shift, dealing with demanding customers and less than generous tips. As she approached table 7, the elderly woman looked up with a warm smile. "Good evening, dear," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentleness that comes with years of life experience. The waitress barely acknowledged the greeting, instead pulling out her order pad with visible impatience. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone clipped and rushed. The elderly woman didn't seem bothered by the cold reception. Instead, she took her time reviewing the menu, occasionally asking questions about the daily specials and ingredients. Each question seemed to further agitate the waitress, who kept glancing at other tables as if counting the minutes until she could walk away. Unknown to the waitress, this elderly customer wasn't just any regular patron. She was Mrs. Chen, the mother of David Chen, who had purchased the diner 5 years ago and transformed it from a struggling establishment into the town's most beloved eatery. Mrs. Chen had made it a habit to visit occasionally, always choosing to dine anonymously to ensure she could observe the true nature of the service. The waitress's patience wore increasingly thin as Mrs. Chen carefully considered her options. Finally, she ordered the house special, meatloaf with mashed potatoes and seasonal vegetables. "And could I have the gravy on the side, please?" she added politely. The waitress scribbled down the order with a barely concealed eye roll. As the evening progressed, the waitress's attitude toward Mrs. Chen only worsened. When bringing water to the table, she practically slammed the glass down, causing some to splash onto the tablecloth. The elderly woman simply dabbed at the spill with her napkin, maintaining her dignified composure. In the kitchen, away from the customer's eyes, the waitress's frustration reached a boiling point. "Table 7 is driving me crazy," she complained to her co-workers, unaware that the kitchen staff had worked at the diner for years and knew exactly who the elderly woman was. They exchanged worried glances but remained silent, knowing it wasn't their place to reveal Mrs. Chen's identity. The situation took a dark turn when the waitress decided to take matters into her own hands. Despite the specific request for gravy on the side, she deliberately drowned the meatloaf in thick brown gravy, muttering under her breath about picky old people. She added extra salt to the mashed potatoes and made sure the vegetables were barely warm. What made this act of defiance even more troubling was that the waitress had recently been warned about her attitude toward customers. The manager had received several complaints about her short temper and lack of professionalism, but she had dismissed these concerns, believing herself to be irreplaceable during the current staff shortage. As she carried the tampered meal to table 7, a self-satisfied smirk played at the corners of her mouth. The elderly woman looked at the plate with surprise but said nothing. She simply picked up her fork and tried to find an edible portion of the oversalted food. Throughout the meal, other regular customers who recognized Mrs. Chen watched the scene unfold with growing concern. They had witnessed the waitress's behavior and knew the restaurant's true owner would soon hear about this incident. Some even took out their phones discreetly, documenting the situation. The evening wore on, and Mrs. Chen ate what she could of the deliberately ruined meal. When asked if everything was all right, she simply nodded with a gentle smile, though her eyes held a hint of disappointment. She had seen many things in her decades of restaurant experience, but such deliberate disrespect was rare. The other staff members went about their duties with growing unease. The head cook, who had worked at the diner for 15 years, couldn't bear to watch anymore. He stepped out of the kitchen and made a quiet phone call, knowing that this situation needed to be addressed before it got even more out of hand. As the sun set completely and the diner's neon signs cast their familiar glow across the parking lot, Mrs. Chen finished what she could of her meal. She carefully wiped her mouth with her napkin and waited patiently for her check. The waitress brought it over with the same dismissive attitude she'd displayed all evening, clearly eager to end her interaction with what she perceived as just another difficult elderly customer. What happened next would become a story told and retold throughout the small town for years to come. As Mrs. Chen reached for her purse to pay the bill, the diner's front door chimed, and her son David walked in, his face a mixture of concern and controlled anger. The waitress, still unaware of the situation, continued collecting payment from other tables, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. The first part of this story ends here, leaving readers eager to discover the consequences of the waitress's actions and the revelation that would shake the foundations of her employment at the Blue Plate Diner. The tension built throughout this section would carry forward into the next part, where the truth would finally come to light in a dramatic confrontation that would change everything. The atmosphere in the diner shifted noticeably as David Chen made his way through the restaurant. Regular customers who knew him tried to appear busy with their meals, while the staff members who had witnessed the evening's events stood frozen in anticipation. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz a little louder in the growing tension. David approached his mother's table with purposeful steps, his usual warm smile replaced by a look of concern. He was a man in his late 40s, dressed in a casual business suit that spoke of a day spent in meetings. The successful businessman had worked his way up from washing dishes in restaurants during his college years to owning several successful establishments, but the Blue Plate Diner held a special place in his heart. "Mom," he said softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Uncle Wong called me about what's been happening here." Mrs. Chen looked up at her son with the same serene expression she had maintained throughout the evening, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. The waitress, who was now at the register counting her tips, finally looked up at the commotion. She watched as David Chen, whom she recognized as the owner, spoke quietly with the elderly woman she had been treating so poorly. The color drained from her face as realization dawned, and the stack of bills in her hands began to tremble slightly. David carefully examined the plate of mostly uneaten food in front of his mother. He picked up the fork and tasted a small portion of the mashed potatoes, his face tightening as he encountered the excessive salt. The other customers in the diner had gone quiet, their own meals forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. "Would you come here for a moment?" David called out to the waitress, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of authority that couldn't be ignored. The other staff members busied themselves with tasks, though everyone was listening intently. The waitress approached the table slowly, her shoes squeaking against the freshly mopped floor. Her previous confidence had evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that made her fidget with her apron. Up close, she could now see the family resemblance between the owner and the elderly woman she had treated so dismissively. "Do you know who this is?" David asked, gesturing to his mother. The waitress shook her head, though her expression showed she had already figured it out. "This is my mother, Mrs. Chen. She helped me buy this diner 5 years ago. Before that, she ran her own restaurant for 30 years. The waitress's face flushed red with embarrassment and fear. Her mind raced back through every interaction she'd had with Mrs. Chen during the evening, each moment of disrespect now playing back like a damning recording. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's exactly the point," Mrs. Chen spoke up, her voice still kind despite everything. "You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect. Every person who walks through that door deserves the same courtesy." The other diners nodded in agreement, some even quietly applauding Mrs. Chen's words. The wisdom in her statement resonated throughout the restaurant, making several other customers reflect on their own behaviors and prejudices. David pulled out a chair and sat down, motioning for the waitress to do the same. This wasn't going to be a public shaming. The Chens didn't believe in humiliating people, even when they made serious mistakes. Instead, this would be a teaching moment. "Tell me," David began, "why did you choose to work in the service industry?" His question caught the waitress off guard. She had expected to be fired on the spot, not engaged in conversation. As she struggled to find an answer, tears began to well up in her eyes. The weight of her actions, combined with the unexpected kindness being shown to her, broke through her defensive walls. The story that emerged was one of struggling to pay for college classes, dealing with difficult customers, and letting frustration build up until it poisoned her attitude toward everyone. Mrs. Chen reached across the table and patted the young woman's hand. "We all have difficult days," she said softly. "But we must never let our struggles become an excuse to treat others poorly. Every person you serve has their own story, their own struggles." The lesson being taught went beyond just restaurant service. It was about basic human dignity and the ripple effects of our actions. Other staff members who had gathered nearby listened intently, knowing they were witnessing something important. David pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket, the same notebook his mother had used to teach him about restaurant management years ago. "I'm going to give you a choice," he said to the waitress. "You can either collect your final paycheck tonight, or you can start fresh tomorrow, with new training, directly under my mother's guidance." The offer stunned everyone in the diner. It was a moment of grace that no one had expected, least of all the waitress herself. The choice presented wasn't just about keeping a job, it was an opportunity for genuine growth and mentorship from someone who had decades of experience in both the restaurant business and in treating people with dignity. Mrs. Chen smiled encouragingly at the young waitress, showing the same warmth she had displayed when first greeting her earlier that evening. The moment hung in the air, heavy with possibility and the potential for transformation. The story of what happened at the Blue Plate Diner that evening would indeed be told for years to come, but not just as a tale of comeuppance. It would be remembered as a moment when punishment was replaced with opportunity, when anger gave way to teaching, and when an act of disrespect was transformed into a chance for growth. As the evening crowd watched and waited for the waitress's decision, the diner's old neon sign continued to buzz outside, casting its warm glow over the parking lot where more customers were arriving, unaware they were about to walk into a moment that would remind everyone about the importance of kindness, second chances, and the dignity every person deserves. The tension in the air was thick with anticipation, as everyone waited to hear what choice the waitress would make, a decision that would not only affect her future but would also set an example for how moments of conflict could be transformed into opportunities for positive change. Tears streamed down the waitress's face as she looked between David and Mrs. Chen, their offer of a second chance hanging in the air like a lifeline. The diner's evening buzz had quieted to a gentle hum, as even the kitchen staff paused their work to await her response. I would like to learn," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling with emotion. "If you're willing to teach me, I want to do better." The words came out softly, but they carried the weight of genuine remorse and determination. Mrs. Chen's face lit up with a warm smile that seemed to brighten the entire restaurant. She reached into her well-worn purse and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age and filled with handwritten notes from her decades in the restaurant business. "Then we begin now," Mrs. Chen said, sliding the notebook across the table. "This contains everything I learned about service, respect, and running a successful restaurant. I gave a similar one to my son when he first started, and now it's your turn to learn." The other staff members exchanged glances of surprise. Mrs. Chen's notebook was legendary among the long-term employees. Many had caught glimpses of it over the years but never had anyone outside the family been offered its wisdom directly. David stood up and addressed the rest of the staff who had gathered nearby. "Everyone, please gather around. What happened tonight isn't just about one person. It's a reminder for all of us about why we're here and what this diner means to our community. The kitchen staff, other waitresses, and even the dishwasher formed a circle around the table. Some pulled up chairs while others leaned against nearby booths. The regular customers watched with interest, sensing they were witnessing something special. Mrs. Chen opened her notebook to the first page and began to share her story. When I first came to this country, she started, her voice carrying years of experience, I worked as a dishwasher in a small restaurant much like this one. I didn't speak much English, and many customers treated me as if I were invisible. The waitress listened intently, her earlier attitude completely transformed by the humbling experience. Mrs. Chen continued, but there was one elderly customer who always smiled at me, who took the time to learn my name, who treated me like a human being. That one person's kindness gave me the strength to keep going, to learn, to grow. As Mrs. Chen spoke, the evening light outside faded into dusk, and the diner's interior lights created a warm, intimate atmosphere. The smell of fresh coffee wafted through the air as the evening shift coffee maker whirred to life, providing a comforting backdrop to the impromptu lesson. Every person who walks through that door, Mrs. Chen gestured toward the entrance, carries their own story, their own struggles, their own dreams. Maybe they're celebrating a promotion, or mourning a loss, or just trying to make it through another difficult day. Our job isn't just to serve food, it's to provide a moment of comfort, of dignity, of respect. David watched proudly as his mother shared the wisdom that had built their family's success. He remembered his own lessons learned at her knee, the countless hours she spent teaching him about more than just running a business. She taught him about understanding people. The waitress opened the notebook with trembling hands and began to read the first entry, the 3 pillars of service: respect, attention, and care. Below were detailed notes about how to greet customers, how to read their moods, how to turn a difficult situation into a positive experience. As the evening progressed, Mrs. Chen shared story after story from her years of experience. She talked about the regular customer who came in every day for a year after losing his wife, how simple kindness helped him through his grief. She spoke about the young student who could only afford coffee but was treated like a valued guest and later became a successful businessman who never forgot that kindness. The other staff members began sharing their own experiences, turning the evening into an impromptu training session that felt more like a family gathering. Even the customers joined in, offering their perspectives on what made the Blue Plate Diner special to them. One elderly regular stood up and shared how the diner had been his sanctuary during a difficult divorce, how the simple act of being treated with dignity had helped him maintain his self-respect during those dark days. Another customer spoke about how the staff had decorated her table for her birthday when she had no family to celebrate with. As these stories filled the air, the waitress began to understand that she wasn't just being offered a second chance at a job, she was being invited into a legacy of service that went far beyond simply taking orders and delivering food. She was being offered the opportunity to become part of something meaningful, something that made a real difference in people's lives. Mrs. Chen turned to a page in her notebook filled with small photographs, snapshots of customers, staff members, and memorable moments from over the years. These are not just customers, she explained, these are our extended family. Each person who walks through that door becomes part of our story, and we become part of theirs. The lesson continued as the night deepened, each story and piece of wisdom building upon the last, creating a tapestry of understanding about what true service means. The waitress took her own notes, filling the margins of Mrs. Chen's notebook with her own observations and insights, already beginning to see her role in a completely new light. What had started as a potentially disastrous evening was transforming into a powerful moment of community, learning, and growth. The Blue Plate Diner was becoming more than just a restaurant, it was becoming a classroom where valuable life lessons were being taught and learned. The following morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the diner's freshly cleaned windows. The waitress arrived an hour early, her hair neatly tied back and her uniform pressed to perfection. She clutched Mrs. Chen's notebook tightly, having spent most of the night reading through its wisdom-filled pages. The pre-dawn quiet of the diner was broken only by the soft sounds of preparation, coffee brewing, bread being sliced, and the gentle hum of the refrigerators. To her surprise, she found Mrs. Chen already there, wearing a simple apron over her dress, arranging freshly cut flowers in small vases for each table. "Good morning," Mrs. Chen greeted warmly, offering her a vase to place. "The day begins long before our first customer arrives. Each flower, each clean fork, each fresh coffee cup, they're all part of the welcome we extend to our guests." Together, they began what Mrs. Chen called the morning ritual of the diner. She showed the waitress how to check each sugar shaker for clumps, how to arrange the creamer dispensers so they poured smoothly, and how to position the napkin holders just so. These small details, Mrs. Chen explained, showed customers that someone cared about their experience. As the morning staff began filtering in, they found Mrs. Chen and the waitress working side by side, preparing for the day ahead. The other employees watched with curiosity and respect as the owner's mother took on the role of mentor with gentle patience and unwavering attention to detail. "Watch how people enter the diner," Mrs. Chen instructed as the first customers began arriving for breakfast. "See how that gentleman's shoulders are tight. He's carrying stress from home or work. A warm smile and a gentle greeting might help ease his burden." The waitress observed as Mrs. Chen demonstrated what she meant, approaching the stressed customer with genuine warmth. "Good morning. Would you like your coffee right away?" The man's tense expression softened visibly at her caring approach, and his entire demeanor shifted. Throughout the morning rush, Mrs. Chen guided the waitress through various situations, teaching her to read people's needs before they expressed them. They learned to notice when a customer's coffee cup was getting low, when someone was struggling to decide what to order, or when a child needed extra napkins before the spill happened. "Every detail matters," Mrs. Chen explained during a brief lull. "Notice how that young mother keeps checking her watch. She's worried about being late. We can serve her quickly without making her feel rushed. It's about finding the balance." The regular customers, many of whom had witnessed the previous evening's events, watched with approval as the waitress transformed under Mrs. Chen's guidance. Gone was the impatient, dismissive attitude, replaced by genuine attention and care for each person she served. During the mid-morning break, Mrs. Chen gathered the entire staff for what she called a family meeting. She brought out a fresh batch of her special almond cookies, a recipe she'd perfected over decades, and began sharing more stories from her notebook. "When I first started in restaurants," she told them, passing around the cookies, "I made many mistakes. Once, I spilled an entire pot of hot soup on myself because I was trying to carry too much at once. But my manager didn't yell at me. Instead, she taught me about patience and proper technique. We must learn from our mistakes, not be defined by them." The waitress listened intently, taking notes in a fresh notebook she'd brought from home. She was beginning to understand that true service was an art form, one that required both skill and heart. Each interaction was an opportunity to make someone's day a little better, to add a moment of kindness to their world. As the lunch rush approached, Mrs. Chen introduced a new challenge. She asked the waitress to observe each customer for a few seconds before approaching their table, to try to understand their needs based on body language and expression. It was like learning a new language, the language of unspoken human needs. "See that couple in the corner?" Mrs. Chen whispered. "Notice how they're sitting slightly apart, barely speaking? They've had an argument. We can help by giving them space, being extra gentle in our service. Sometimes, a neutral, peaceful environment is what people need to find their way back to each other." The lunch rush brought its own set of challenges, but the waitress faced them with a new perspective. When a customer complained about their soup being too cold, she handled it with grace and efficiency, remembering Mrs. Chen's teachings about turning difficult moments into opportunities for excellent service. Throughout the day, regular customers began to notice the change. Some even commented on the waitress's transformation, impressed by her newfound attention to detail and genuine care. Each compliment served as confirmation that she was on the right path, learning and growing with each interaction. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the diner's checkered floor as Mrs. Chen and the waitress sat down for a brief rest. The older woman pulled out her notebook again, this time turning to a section about handling difficult situations. In all my years, Mrs. Chen shared, I've learned that the most challenging customers often become our most loyal friends once we understand their story. Tomorrow, we'll work on turning complaints into opportunities for connection. As the day wound down, the waitress realized that she'd experienced more than just a training session. She'd been given a glimpse into a philosophy of service that had been cultivated over generations. The Blue Plate Diner wasn't just a restaurant, it was a place where the art of human connection was practiced daily. Looking around at the now familiar faces of her co-workers and the comfortable bustle of the evening service, she felt a sense of belonging she'd never experienced before in any job. She was becoming part of something larger than herself, a tradition of service that transformed simple meals into meaningful experiences. A week had passed since the memorable evening that changed everything at the Blue Plate Diner. The early autumn breeze carried fallen leaves across the parking lot as Mrs. Chen and the waitress prepared for what would be their most challenging day of training yet. Today, Mrs. Chen announced, pulling out a special section from her notebook, we learn about the heart of our business, handling special celebrations. Her eyes twinkled as she spoke, hinting at the meaningful lessons ahead. The diner had been specially reserved for a significant event, a golden wedding anniversary celebration for a couple who had been coming to the restaurant every Sunday for the past 30 years. It would be the waitress's first major test under Mrs. Chen's guidance. Uncle Lee and Aunt May aren't just customers, Mrs. Chen explained as they prepared the dining room. They had their first date in this very booth. Back then, this place was called Joe's Diner, but the magic of the place remained the same. She ran her hand lovingly along the worn leather of the booth seat. The waitress absorbed every detail as they transformed the diner. They arranged tables in a U-shape, creating an intimate space for the family gathering. Mrs. Chen taught her how to fold napkins into delicate flowers, a skill she had learned from her own mother decades ago. Watch how I do this, Mrs. Chen demonstrated, her fingers moving deftly. Each fold is like wrapping a gift. We're not just setting a table, we're creating memories. The waitress followed along, her initially clumsy attempts gradually becoming more polished under the patient guidance. As other staff members arrived, they joined in the preparations. The cook prepared special dishes that weren't on the regular menu, family recipes that Uncle Lee and Aunt May had enjoyed over the years. The aroma of slow-cooked spices and herbs filled the air, creating an atmosphere of homey comfort. The waitress found herself caught up in the excitement, suggesting little touches she had learned from studying Mrs. Chen's notebook. She noticed that Aunt May always appreciated fresh flowers, so she carefully arranged golden chrysanthemums on each table, a detail that brought a proud smile to Mrs. Chen's face. You see? Mrs. Chen said softly, you're learning to see beyond the order pad. This is what makes a good server great, anticipating, remembering, caring about the little things that matter to each person. As the afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the windows, the first guests began to arrive. The waitress watched in amazement as Mrs. Chen greeted each family member by name, remembering details about their lives that made each interaction personal and warm. The celebration began with Uncle Lee and Aunt May's arrival. The elderly couple paused at the entrance, overwhelmed by the transformation of their favorite diner. Tears welled up in Aunt May's eyes as she took in the golden decorations, the familiar faces, and the love that radiated from every corner. Under Mrs. Chen's guidance, the waitress found herself moving through the celebration with a grace she never knew she possessed. She remembered each guest's drink preference, anticipated needs before they arose, and maintained a warm presence that added to the joyous atmosphere. During dinner service, a small crisis arose when one of the grandchildren accidentally spilled a glass of juice. Before anyone could react, the waitress was there with extra napkins and a warm smile, turning what could have been a disturbing moment into a smooth transition, just as Mrs. Chen had taught her. "Did you see how naturally you handled that?" Mrs. Chen whispered during a quiet moment. "A month ago, you might have seen it as an annoyance. Today, you saw it as an opportunity to show care. That's growth." The evening progressed like a well-orchestrated symphony, with each staff member playing their part perfectly. The waitress found herself sharing in the joy of the celebration, understanding now what Mrs. Chen had meant about being part of people's stories. As Uncle Lee stood to make a speech, he specifically mentioned the diner's staff, speaking about how this place had been more than just a restaurant to his family. "This is where our love story began," he said, holding Aunt May's hand. "And all of you have been part of our story ever since." The waitress felt tears welling up in her own eyes as she listened. She thought back to her first days at the diner, how she had seen each customer as just another task to complete. Now, she understood the deeper meaning of service, the privilege of being part of people's most precious moments. Near the end of the evening, as the celebration wound down, Aunt May approached the waitress with a small, wrapped package. "Mrs. Chen told us about your journey," she said softly. "We wanted you to have this." Inside was a vintage photograph of the Blue Plate Diner from decades ago, with a young Uncle Lee and Aunt May standing in front. The gesture touched something deep in the waitress's heart. She carefully placed the photograph in Mrs. Chen's notebook, adding another layer to the growing collection of memories and lessons she was gathering. As the last guests left and the cleanup began, Mrs. Chen gathered everyone in the kitchen. "Tonight wasn't just about serving food," she said, looking proudly at her staff. "Tonight was about creating moments that people will remember for the rest of their lives. That's the true magic of what we do." The waitress looked around at her colleagues, at the remnants of the celebration, and at Mrs. Chen's beaming face. She understood now that she wasn't just learning a job, she was becoming part of a legacy of care, service, and human connection that went far beyond the walls of the Blue Plate Diner. 2 months had passed since the golden anniversary celebration, and the transformation at the Blue Plate Diner was remarkable. The crisp winter air carried the scent of freshly baked pies through the restaurant as Mrs. Chen prepared for another important lesson. "Today," she announced, settling into a quiet booth with the waitress during the morning lull, "we talk about something very special, helping people through their difficult times." She opened her notebook to a well-worn page filled with carefully written observations. The diner had become known as more than just a place to eat, it was a sanctuary for many in the community. Mrs. Chen explained how regular customers often came in during their darkest moments, seeking not just nourishment for their bodies, but comfort for their souls. "Watch table 4, Mrs. Chen said softly, gesturing toward a middle-aged man sitting alone. "He lost his job last week. He's been coming in every morning, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy." The waitress noticed how the man's shoulders slumped, how he stirred his coffee without really drinking it. Following Mrs. Chen's lead, the waitress approached the table with gentle attention. She didn't just take his order, she created a moment of genuine human connection. "Would you like your usual morning paper?" she asked kindly, remembering how he used to read it during his work breaks. The man looked up, surprised and touched that someone had noticed his routine. "That would be nice," he replied, his voice slightly rough with emotion. Mrs. Chen watched approvingly as the waitress handled the interaction with perfect balance, present but not intrusive, caring but not overwhelming. Throughout the day, Mrs. Chen shared more stories from her years of experience. She spoke about the widow who came in every Tuesday, ordering dinner for 2 out of habit, and how they quietly packed half as takeout without comment. She told of the young student struggling with exam stress, who just needed a quiet corner and endless coffee refills. "The secret," Mrs. Chen explained, "is to make everyone feel seen without making them feel exposed. It's a delicate balance, like walking on a tightrope while carrying a full pot of coffee." Her eyes crinkled with warmth as she watched her student absorb these lessons. The afternoon brought a rush of customers, each with their own story. The waitress found herself noticing things she would have missed before: a teenager sitting alone after school, clearly avoiding going home, a couple receiving what looked like difficult news over their lunch, an elderly person counting change carefully before ordering. Mrs. Chen observed proudly as the waitress handled each situation with growing confidence and sensitivity. For the teenager, she found a quiet corner booth and brought an extra portion of fries, on the house. For the couple, she created a bubble of privacy by subtly managing the seating around them. For the elderly person, she quietly suggested the daily special, which happened to be on discount. During the afternoon lull, Mrs. Chen gathered the staff for another family meeting. Our job, she began, is not just about feeding people. Sometimes, we're the only kind face someone sees all day. Sometimes, we're the only ones who notice when something's wrong. The cook shared a story about a regular customer who suddenly switched from ordering spicy dishes to bland ones. We realized something was wrong, he explained. Turned out they were going through chemotherapy. Now we prepare special meals that they can enjoy, even on their tough days. As the day progressed, the diner received an unexpected visitor. The man who had lost his job returned, this time with news. He'd found a new position and wanted to share his happiness with the people who had helped him through his difficult time. The way his face lit up when the waitress remembered his usual order and congratulated him sincerely showed the impact of their careful attention. You see? Mrs. Chen said quietly, we're not just serving food. We're holding space for people's lives, their joys, their sorrows, their everyday moments. That's why every detail matters, why every interaction counts. The evening brought a gentle rain, and the diner's windows steamed up with warmth from inside. The soft lighting created a cozy atmosphere as the dinner crowd began to arrive. Mrs. Chen and the waitress worked side by side, each movement now a synchronized dance of service and care. A young couple came in, soaking wet from the rain and clearly having had an argument. The waitress caught Mrs. Chen's subtle nod and knew exactly what to do. She seated them at the corner booth, the one with the best view of the rain-streaked windows, and brought them hot tea without being asked. The diner isn't just a business, Mrs. Chen reflected as they watched the couple gradually relax and begin talking quietly. It's a place where life happens, where stories unfold, where hearts heal. Every cup of coffee can be a moment of comfort, every meal a chance for connection. As closing time approached, the waitress looked around at the familiar space with new eyes. The worn booths, the slightly crooked pictures on the walls, the soft clink of dishes from the kitchen, it all meant something different now. She understood that she wasn't just working in a restaurant, she was part of a community lifeline. Mrs. Chen closed her notebook for the evening, but not before adding a new entry. Today, she wrote, I watched someone understand the true meaning of service. It's not about the perfect cup of coffee or the flawless table setting. It's about being present, being kind, and being ready to help carry someone else's burden, even if just for the length of a meal. Winter had settled in fully around the Blue Plate diner, and Christmas decorations twinkled in the frosty windows. The morning light was still dim when Mrs. Chen arrived to find the waitress already there, carefully hanging paper snowflakes she had made at home. These are beautiful, Mrs. Chen said, touching one of the delicate creations. But why are you here so early? The pride in her voice was evident as she watched her student arrange the decorations with careful attention to detail. The waitress smiled, her eyes bright with purpose. I remembered what you wrote in your notebook about the holiday season. How it can be both joyful and difficult for people. I wanted to make the diner feel extra special this year. She pointed to a basket near the counter filled with small, wrapped packages. What are these? Mrs. Chen asked, picking up one of the carefully wrapped items. They're cookie packages from the recipe you taught me, the waitress explained. For customers who spend the holidays alone. I thought maybe it would help them feel remembered. Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had truly understood the deeper meaning of their work. Mrs. Chen's eyes welled with tears as she hugged her student. Over the past few months, she had watched the waitress transform from someone who saw customers as burdens into someone who understood the sacred trust of serving others. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm, but there was something different in the air. Regular customers noticed the extra touches, the handmade decorations, the subtle holiday music playing softly in the background, the warm aroma of cinnamon and nutmeg from the kitchen. A group of nurses from the nearby hospital arrived for breakfast after their night shift, looking exhausted. Without being asked, the waitress brought them fresh coffee and warm muffins while they settled in. "On the house," she said softly. "Thank you for taking care of our community." Mrs. Chen watched from the counter, remembering her own early days of learning to read people's needs. She saw how the waitress now moved through the diner with grace and purpose, anticipating needs before they were spoken, offering comfort in subtle ways. During the lunch rush, an elderly man came in, clutching a worn photograph. He was a new face at the diner, and his hands trembled slightly as he sat down. The waitress approached his table with gentle attention, noticing how he kept looking at the empty chair across from him. "Is this your first time visiting us?" she asked warmly, setting down a menu. The man nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "My wife and I used to go to a diner just like this one, before she..." He trailed off, gesturing to the photograph. It showed a smiling couple in front of a Christmas tree. Without hesitation, the waitress pulled out Mrs. Chen's notebook and opened it to a specific page. "Would you like to see something?" she asked. She showed him the collection of photographs Mrs. Chen had gathered over the years, snapshots of couples, families, and individuals who had made the diner part of their story. "May I add your photo to our collection?" she asked gently. "Your wife's memory would be honored here." The man's eyes filled with tears as he carefully handed over the photograph, watching as it was lovingly added to the notebook's pages. Throughout the afternoon, more stories unfolded. A young mother struggling with 3 energetic children found herself surrounded by subtle support. Extra napkins appeared before spills happened, small activities materialized to keep tiny hands busy, and her coffee was always hot and full. A teenager sitting alone at the counter, clearly troubled, received not just a meal but a listening ear. The waitress remembered Mrs. Chen's teachings about creating safe spaces, about being present without being intrusive. As evening approached, David Chen arrived for his regular check-in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene before him. The diner glowed with warmth, both from the holiday decorations and from the genuine care that radiated from every interaction. He found his mother in the kitchen, teaching the cook's young son how to make her special holiday dumplings. The boy's father watched proudly as his child learned the traditional recipe, creating another bridge between cultures, generations, and hearts. "Mom," David said softly, "look what you've created here." He gestured toward the dining room, where the waitress was carefully wrapping one of her cookie packages for an elderly customer who had mentioned spending Christmas alone. Mrs. Chen smiled, her eyes following her son's gaze. "No," she corrected gently, "look what we've all created together. A place where everyone belongs, where kindness is served alongside every meal, where stories are honored and new ones begin." The evening wound down with a special moment. The staff gathered for their end-of-day meeting, but this time, the waitress had something to share. She pulled out her own notebook, a beautiful leather-bound volume similar to Mrs. Chen's. "I've started my own collection," she explained, opening it to reveal carefully documented stories, photographs, and observations. "Because someday, I want to teach others what you've taught me, that true service is about nourishing souls as much as bodies." Mrs. Chen touched the pages of the new notebook gently, seeing her legacy continuing through her students' dedication. The Blue Plate Diner had become more than just a restaurant, it was a place where the art of human connection was practiced and passed on, where every meal served came with a side of compassion, and where every person who walked through the door became part of an ongoing story of community and care. Spring had returned to the Blue Plate Diner, and with it came a special celebration. The morning sun streamed through windows that had been decorated with fresh flowers and cheerful streamers. Today marked 1 year since that fateful evening when a simple act of disrespect had transformed into a profound journey of growth and learning. The staff had arrived early, each person carrying dishes prepared from recipes in Mrs. Chen's notebook. The waitress, now a respected senior server and trainer herself, stood beside Mrs. Chen as they prepared for a day unlike any other. "Look how far we've come," Mrs. Chen said softly, watching as the diner filled with familiar faces. Regular customers, both old and new, had been invited to share in this celebration of community and connection. The tables were arranged in a way that encouraged conversation and sharing, just as Mrs. Chen had taught. Uncle Li and Aunt May were among the first to arrive, bringing with them a framed photograph of their golden anniversary celebration. For the wall, Aunt May explained, pointing to what had become known as the memory wall, a collection of photographs and stories that chronicled the diner's role in countless lives. The man who had lost his job, now successful in his new career, arrived with his family. The elderly gentleman who had shared his wife's photograph sat with new friends he'd made over countless morning coffees. The young student who had struggled with exam stress came bearing news of her college acceptance. As people settled in, David Chen stood to address the gathering. "A year ago," he began, "this diner was just a place to eat. Today, thanks to my mother's wisdom and the dedication of our staff, it has become the heart of our community." The waitress watched as Mrs. Chen dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. She remembered every lesson, every story, every moment of guidance that had brought them to this day. The notebook she'd been given, now filled with her own observations and experiences, sat proudly beside Mrs. Chen's original. Throughout the day, people shared stories of how the Blue Plate Diner had touched their lives. A young couple spoke about how they'd met over spilled coffee at table 6. A group of nurses talked about the countless early mornings when the diner's warmth had helped them through difficult shifts. The cook's son, now a regular helper in the kitchen, proudly served dumplings he'd learned to make from Mrs. Chen. Each dumpling was shaped slightly differently, but as Mrs. Chen had taught them all, perfection wasn't in the appearance, it was in the care and love that went into making them. As afternoon turned to evening, Mrs. Chen gathered everyone for a special announcement. "When I first came to this country," she began, her voice carrying years of wisdom, "I dreamed of creating a place where everyone would feel welcomed, valued, and cared for. Today, I see that dream has grown beyond anything I could have imagined." She turned to the waitress, holding out her original notebook. "It's time for this to have a new guardian," she said. "You've not only learned its lessons but added your own wisdom to its pages. Now it's your turn to teach others." The waitress accepted the notebook with trembling hands, understanding the magnitude of this moment. This wasn't just about recipes and service techniques, it was about carrying forward a legacy of compassion, understanding, and genuine human connection. David watched proudly as his mother passed on her treasured notebook. He remembered the night a year ago when they could have simply fired a disrespectful employee. Instead, his mother's wisdom had turned that moment into an opportunity for transformation, not just for one person, but for the entire community. As the celebration continued, new customers walked in, drawn by the warmth and joy emanating from the diner. They found themselves welcomed into the celebration, quickly becoming part of the extended family that the Blue Plate Diner had created. The waitress moved through the crowd, now confident in her role as both server and keeper of stories. She watched as new connections formed between strangers, as comfort was offered to those who needed it, and as simple meals became moments of meaningful connection. Near closing time, a young waitress from another restaurant down the street came in, having heard about the celebration. She watched in wonder as she witnessed the special atmosphere of the Blue Plate Diner. The waitress recognized the look in the young woman's eyes, the same one she must have had a year ago when Mrs. Chen first offered to teach her. With a warm smile, she opened the notebook and said, "Would you like to learn something wonderful?" As the day drew to a close, Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway of her beloved diner. She watched as the last customers lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth of community they'd found there. The memory wall glowed with a year's worth of stories, each photograph representing a life touched by the simple magic of caring service. The Blue Plate Diner had become more than just a success story. It was a testament to the power of second chances, the importance of wisdom passed down through generations, and the profound impact of treating every person with dignity and respect. As the lights dimmed and the staff prepared to close, Mrs. Chen smiled contentedly. The legacy she had built would continue, growing and evolving with each new person who learned the true meaning of service, not just as a job, but as a way of touching lives, one meal, one smile, one moment of kindness at a time. The story of the disrespectful waitress who became a guardian of tradition had become part of the diner's legend, a reminder that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with a simple choice to learn, to grow, and to see the dignity in every person who walks through the door.